We don't need to have a trade war in order to have full employment domestically. We can just decide to have full employment domestically. We do not have to run our international economic relations as though we are in a competitive fight with the rest of the world to be able to provide people with jobs. But we do have to change the paradigm as far as economics is concerned. The old neoclassical or neoliberal economics that everybody is familiar with has failed us and is continuing to fail us. It's led us to Donald Trump. It's led us to inequality around the world, and we need to get beyond it. It's not fit for purpose.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Just wanted to jump in here to remind our UK listeners that Professor Stephen Hale, who's our guest this week, will soon be teaching 2 interactive workshops in London on the last 2 weekends of June, aimed at introducing people to real-world economics and correcting the false narrative that our vital public goods and services like the NHS need to be either paid for by the rich or else cut via deadly austerity measures. There are prices to suit every pocket for these seminars, including free, so check out the link to modernmoneylab.org.uk in our show notes. This episode is part 2 of a 2-part conversation, so you might want to check out part 1 before we go any further. But if you want to dive in here, in part 1, we talked about how the UK government spends, which is via money creation. The government spends new money into existence every time it spends. There is no other way for the government to spend. So, as far as the government's concerned, the money to serve public purpose, to save lives and the planet we depend on, that money is available to be spent today. The government does not have to wait to get money from rich people to be able to spend it. In fact, the money to pay taxes or to buy government bonds must have come from the government in the first instance, or it's counterfeit. So, given that reality, insisting on a wealth tax to quote-unquote fund and to therefore precede life-saving public spending is, in effect, delaying the implementation of life-saving measures for no reason. As you'll hear me say at the beginning of this episode, and I'm quoting a central banker when I say this, taxes for revenue are obsolete. Taxes to make the rich less economically and politically powerful than the rest of us are a good idea. And high top rates of income tax and lower rates on lower income households achieved a fairer distribution in the past. But unfortunately, that's not what's being proposed by prominent progressive commentators. What's being proposed is a 2% tax on wealth, which will do effectively nothing to curb the power of the rich. And what's worse, it's being framed as a means to fund public services. And that framing holds our public money hostage to the willingness of donor-dependent politicians to tax wealth. I don't know if you've noticed, but that's something they've been really bad at doing historically. Meanwhile, disabled people, elderly people, children trying to survive in poverty, and other vulnerable people have had their lifelines cut, and they need them restored today and not some imaginary point in the future when a government, led by a guy whose name starts with Sir, suddenly becomes a champion of everyday people. So, just to be clear, taxing the rich to make the world a more equal place is a good idea, but making public policy dependent on the government's willingness to tax the rich is a bad idea. When we debate about who should pay tax and how much tax they should pay, we're arguing about what should happen to money after it's already been spent into existence. As the prominent economics YouTuber Gary Stevenson puts it on his website, quote, "The fact is, money has to originate somewhere. Someone has to be able to make it, or it wouldn't exist. In this country, that responsibility is given to the Bank of England. They have the legal right to create money, and in fact, they are constantly creating new money every single month. That is a key central fact about how our monetary system works. End quote. Given the Bank of England is wholly owned by the government and, as its fiscal agent, must execute all payments it's instructed to make by the government, it's a little puzzling to hear Gary also telling his audience that the UK government, quote, can't afford to fund itself, unquote. So while you're waiting for that cognitive dissonance to resolve, if you'd like to know how government spending works in the real world, I've linked to some of our relevant episodes and to some other things from press articles to peer-reviewed studies in the show notes for this episode, where, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes, including Q&A episodes where we answer audience questions. Your financial support really helps keep this show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks, as ever, for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Let's just reinforce taxes for revenue are obsolete. So wealth taxes for revenue are obsolete, but we want to do something to make society more equitable, obviously. Now, Gary Stevenson's big idea on his website is not actually a wealth tax. In fact, if you go through his website and his YouTube channel, he talks a lot about, we can't do anything until there's a wealth tax, or we can't do anything until we tax the rich, but there isn't really a call to action at all. There's no petition to sign. There's nothing like that. If you go into his website, his idea is not a wealth tax. It's a time limit on owning physical property. And he writes, it's the same way we place a time limit on intellectual property. It would be perfectly fine for people to trade it and own it, but not own it forever, for long after they are dead. And he reasons, if one small group of people are allowed to own all of the land and property forever, then the majority will always be poor. Let's place a long time limit on ownership of physical property. It could be very long as 150 years. Once someone is dead, they can pass their assets to their children, but only until that 150-year time limit is reached. This encourages the very wealthy to spend rather than save forever their assets. And it involves no state involvement. End quote. What do you think about that, Stephen? I think there's a lot of problems there.
Wait, how does it involve no state involvement?
Exactly. I mean, who would be enforcing this?
There is a system a little bit like that, as far as land is concerned, in the ACT.
Sorry, what's the ACT?
The ACT is Australian Capital Territories. It's a small area of land around Canberra, which is our capital. Canberra was set up just over 100 years ago during the height of the Georgist Henry George obsession with land tax, and consequently in the ACT is often owned by the territory government and on a long lease to people who live on it. But I noticed you were reading from Gary's proposal there, and it was saying 150 years.
Yeah, it's pretty long.
If we don't get a grip on what's happening to our ecological space, we're not going to have a human civilization in 150 years' time. But anyway, that's one thing. Another thing is this would involve a hell of a fight, and there are many much simpler things that we could be doing to limit the inequality of income and wealth that we have in society. And indeed, we had much lower levels of inequality of income and wealth 50 years ago.
So it's not some exotic thing that we have to get a sci-fi writer to come up with.
No, that the distribution of income and wealth, in my opinion, was perfectly acceptable in the UK in about 1970. It would be difficult to get back to that sort of distribution. We're not saying that we want to return to the institutions and technology and monetary system that existed then, but there are a variety of practical proposals, and Gary's proposal is simply not practical. There's never going to be a government elected which is going to have that amongst its policy proposals. So what about concentrating on things that there's actually a possibility at some point in the next 5 to 10 years of genuinely doing, providing people with a better, more secure quality of life at the bottom of the distribution, taking action to make decent housing more available and affordable as a human right, limit excessive incomes, as we were saying earlier. The really wasteful part of the UK economy, although I admit, but I wouldn't be too concerned about this, but I admit dealing with it would have implications for financial markets and for the pound, is the finance sector. The UK finance sector is far too big. It distorts everything else. If you look back, if you go online and check on the financial services in the UK as a share of GDP, and you think it grew really large during the Thatcher years, but it didn't. It grew during the Labour years, Blair and Brown, after it was deregulated.
It's like our version of Clinton, right?
It is, although for much of the time since then, the finance sector in the UK has been a bigger share of GDP than in the US. They doubled it within about 10 years. It's come back a bit now. It went from about 5% of GDP to over 10% of GDP. When the global financial crisis came down, I think it's something like 8 or 9% again now. And these people have access to huge amounts of real resources. There are enormous amounts of real resources involved in doing pointless things in the financial sector that we really don't need to be done, including trading in, speculating in treasury bonds, a variety of derivatives, crypto as well. So if you were a UK progressive, I'd be interested in a serious discussion about what kind of Britain we want to exist 10 years from now, and what kind of financial system and how big should the financial sector be within the UK economy. Because we're talking about things like the inequality of income and wealth, then it's the finance sector that's distorted everything else, in my opinion. The foundations for that were laid by Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson, but it was really turbocharged when Tony Blair was elected in 1997 and deregulated the finance system, and then it grew very rapidly until the GFC, and it's only shrunk a little bit as a share of the economy since then. It's still too big. It makes up, I think, something like a quarter of UK exports, so financial services. So this is a serious problem dealing with this issue, but I think this is the direction that we ought to be looking at if we want there to be a sustainable or an equitable UK economy with a lower degree of inequality of income and wealth in 5, 10, 15 years' time.
I mean, it seems reasonable at first glance that Gary is looking at real wealth as opposed to nominal wealth for his proposal. So in a way, you know, I'm heartened to see him doing that. But it just seems to me like, let's say with intellectual property, like a song or a book or a film or an industrial process, after 70 years, or whatever term you choose, if it becomes public property, you turn it into a digital rights management free version of it, like a PDF or an MP3, MP4. You put it out there and it's for everybody, and you publish it and it's public property. Now, you can't really do that with physical property. Like, you know, with physical property, the first wave of people who are forced to sell up, at that point, the only people who can afford to buy the property that's just come on the market is other wealthy people. So it just seems we're just going to have like wealthy people swapping estates with each other every 150 years.
If you want to just take rich people's wealth away, just take it away.
Yeah.
Don't say you're taking it away in 150 years' time.
Yeah. And we're also, I don't think we need to just not be shy about saying, instead of like taxing and, you know, tax the rich, tax the ones, they're just like, no, just confiscation. But then again, who's going to vote for that?
Well, exactly. I'm not really interested in proposals unless I think there is some chance in my lifetime of them being enacted.
I think confiscation can be justified, but on an asset by asset basis. Like we said, you know, if the rich have really accumulated most of the land that used to be part of the commons, then we need to get that back. And we can probably, you know, run a limited campaign saying, you know, let's recover green spaces in London, or, you know, that there's plenty of public spaces in London that have been sold off recently, or something like that. And I think that could get some support.
I think there's quite a few palaces knocking about that would make really good council housing.
Yeah.
Stop banks lending against financial assets.
Yes, absolutely.
Limit opportunities for financial speculation. Look very carefully at how derivatives are regulated and which derivatives play a legitimate role in the management of risk and which are there just for gambling. Look very carefully with other governments at the role that cryptocurrencies play within our societies now?
It's all fraud.
Yes, well, there are a variety of ways in which, without technically expropriating assets from rich people, you can make those rich people much less rich without necessarily having a revolution by potentially actually winning a general election. At the same time, invest in people at the bottom, as we were saying, in the welfare system, through a job guarantee and through affordable, universal public services, and stress the positive side of things. That's the important part of the message. At the same time, you need to create space within the productive capacity of the economy. So there is some consumption which is wasteful, which should be cut back on. And that's the consumption of the top 10% and especially the top 1% of the wealth distribution.
That's so well put. And I'm really glad you said that, because it kind of preempts what I wanted to get to, because I know that Gary Stevenson comes to his ideas about fixing inequality via a certain view. And again, I'm just going to quote from his website. He goes, there's a number of ways that wealth inequality could be reduced, but we can divide them all into one of two methods. Either the very wealthy increase their spending and reduce their saving, or the government directly taxes their wealth. And really, I think what we're saying is, no, that's not right. There are other things that don't fall into those two categories, and like you just said, Stephen, we can always increase public wealth via universal public services, via housing, via jobs for all. I've never forgotten, there's a line in Jamie Galbraith's book about inequality. It goes something like, the only wealth the vast majority of people can ever hope to hold is public wealth. And that's where we can make a difference. We don't have to wait for the rich to suddenly become generous in order to do that.
Absolutely. There are a variety of ways of promoting a radically lower degree of income and wealth inequality. The first thing that a Labour government should do, and I've begged them to do this in Australia for years and they never have, is to target inequality. We have various ways of measuring it. Announce a public target. If you're in power for 5 years, we will reduce the inequality of net income once you've, done the appropriate equivalisation for different household sizes and other reasons. Or if you want to pick on wealth inequality, pick on wealth inequality. Inequality is growing too high. We're going to reduce inequality. If we have to use the tax system to reduce inequality, we will. If we are off target after 2 years, then we will get ourselves back onto target using the tax and welfare system. But we've got some other things we're going to try first, because I think inequality is vitally important for a wide variety of reasons, including the power that the ultra-rich have, of course, but also because I do think we have a problem to live within our planetary boundaries and give everybody the opportunity of a good quality of life while we do it.
Yeah. So while we're talking about policies that we could vote for, that we could get behind, we've got some decent allies in the Green Party in the UK, I would say, at the moment. And Patricia, you recently replied to Zach Polanski, the deputy leader. He tweeted, "Tax wealth, not work." We'll talk about that slogan in a minute, but he said, "Tax wealth, not work." And you replied, "You could have the most amazing manifesto if you include a job guarantee," which is, something that we love. "The abolition of VAT on anything other than luxury items, introduce an excess wealth/income tax, and index public sector wages, pensions, and benefits to the inflation target, zero interest rate policy, and end interest rates on reserves." So there's a lot in there. It all sounds great to me.
Well, if you've got a zero interest rate policy, you don't need zero interest on reserves because there'll be zero anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tweet, not an academic paper,
No, it's great. And of course, I'm reluctant to name the person, but as you know, a fellow student of yours, Christian, is working very hard on these issues for us right in the middle.
Who is a legend.
Who is a legend, yes, absolutely.
Anyway, just digging into that a little bit, Patricia.
I just think we're too focused on the quantity of spending and less focused on the principle behind the spending. It's like we need to establish a principle of what are the types of things that we're going to spend on. And really, if we're going to be, obviously public purpose is the big word, but what does that entail? Firstly, it entails making sure that everybody who wants to work has decent employment, and that decent employment gives them the income they need to have a decent standard of living. That's the minimum, right? So that's the job guarantee. And then you have, of course, taking care of those that can't work and that we actually need to support. And obviously, doctors should be making that decision as to who can and can't work, not some random administrative person that has targets set by God knows whom that have nothing to do with the real, conditions of the person that they're interviewing. And make sure that those people who, through no fault of their own, cannot work, they also have a decent standard of living, a la par with those who can. And then on the other side, you have what are the types of things that we want to give people income for? And I don't see how you morally justify giving people to have money, free money. And that's where the interest rates come in.
Just to make the distinction, you mean people who already have money, they get additional free money just for having money?
Yes. They get a pat in the head, have here more money just because you have money.
Which is what paying interest on reserves and issuing gilts does, basically.
Yes, effectively. And I also understand that within that group of people that I've just mentioned are people who are trying to save for a pension, including myself. I have a private pension. And we're in this bizarre situation with making pensions dependent on that, on the income of private firms and dependent on bond issuance. And so we don't have to. We can detach both of those things and still make alternative arrangements for pensions and stop issuing bonds that also benefit other players that have nothing to do with pensions. The issue is as well that in the UK, I don't know how it's in Australia, presumably it's the same thing, but
much worse where pensions are concerned.
We're not allowed to know who holds the bonds. So people say, oh, well, bonds are really important for pension funds and pension funds hold a lot of bonds. Okay. But statistically speaking, we don't know who holds more bonds than others because we're not allowed to know who holds the bonds. So we don't know who the main beneficiaries are or even who other secondary beneficiaries are who are unintended beneficiaries of the bond issuance. And I really don't like that at all because it's, bond issuance is fiscal policy. Giving out earnings from interest rates are a backdoor type of fiscal policy.
Well, they are. Not that backdoor either. I mean, we used to say people regard bond issuance as fiscal policy, but it used to be monetary policy because when they were keeping banks short of reserves, that was the motivation back in the 1980s for auctioning treasury bonds in order to match deficit spending. It was because the Bank of England used to set a policy interest rate they used to call the minimum lending rate in those days by keeping the banks a little bit short of reserves. And of course, deficit spending puts extra reserves into the banking system. So you then auction treasury bonds in order to drain those reserves again. But that hasn't been valid in the UK for at least 15 years now. Banks have had excess reserves. That's what quantitative easing was all about. So yes, there's absolutely no obligation to issue.
But they were doing QT recently, right?
They paused it a bit. They started shrinking the Bank of England balance sheet, but they haven't got very far. But anyway, that's going off the point a bit. I was going to say Australia is worse than the UK because in Australia, a Labour government, when Paul Keating was the Prime Minister in the early 1990s, moved us to a compulsory tax advantage private, what we call superannuation system. So we all have money taken out of our pay every month and our employers chip in a bit too, in principle, that goes into a superannuation fund, which means that little old Australia now has the biggest pool of retirement savings in the world. Our fund managers have got far too much money. They don't know what to do with all this money that they've been given. It's basically a tax, but the tax has enriched our bloated superannuation system. And at least at the moment, the fiscal cost, if you want to think of it as a cost, of the tax concessions on the superannuation investments of rich people are greater than the cost of paying state pensions to those people who don't have these big super funds that are dependent on our ridiculously low-level state pension. Of course, looking after the elderly is about real resources. So if you have care homes and workers with skills and facilities, and if you're healthy, when you're old, if you have the ability to supply goods and services that elderly people will need to consume, then the government's not going to run out of money to be able to provide those services. On the other hand, if you don't have those skilled workers and those facilities, then if people have got a lot of in inverted commas, wealth in their superannuation fund that they can draw down on when they're in retirement. You're just going to have more taxes or find some other way of limiting private spending, because any spending by them will be inflationary. This goes back to the idea that the government might run out of money because it can't afford to pay a state pension to an ageing population. Absolute nonsense, but it's something that Labour Prime Minister Paul Keating bought into in the early 1990s. And much to my shame, when I met Paul Keating in 2020, I didn't have the self-confidence, or maybe I just didn't want to be rude to somebody who's seen as iconic in the Labour movement in Australia by confronting him with it, but I should have done. A lot of the problems that we face today in both of our countries, we face because of measures that have been taken over the last generation or two by Labour governments.
Yeah, which is why I was worried about this government.
Yeah, this government is potentially worse than the previous ones.
So just to cap off this wealth tax topic, given everything that we've just said, the slogan that we hear a lot is tax wealth, not work. But to put you on the spot, is there a better slogan, given that a wealth tax will not pay for the things we want it to pay for because taxes for revenue are obsolete?
Work out what the tax system is for and then design your taxes.
God, it's less catchy, isn't it?
Well, I can't do a catchy one, but that's the right order to do it. What do we have the tax system for?
Yeah.
And then that tells you, for example, if we're thinking about the tax system as a way of limiting inflation, well, taxing really rich people isn't going to help much. If we're thinking about the tax system as a way of limiting inequality, well, taxing really rich people will help. But you have to know what the taxes are for before you design your tax system.
Yes. So for reasons that we've just been talking about for the last little while, taxing wealth might not be the way to get to that equitable situation. So I had the idea, what, tax rents not work?
Well, there are people who are asking for tax in land, right? And there are benefits to that. It turns out it results in more efficient use of land. But ultimately, the tax does get passed on to whoever pays rent, right?
That's what the Georgists used to say 100 years ago. Now, do you know what? I don't want to die in a ditch. So whatever is the sort of national consensus about the right way to design your particular tax system, just make sure that it, along with other tools, is used in order to limit the inequality of income and wealth and to create room within the productive capacity of the economy to allow for vitally important government investments to take place.
Well put. I was going to say, look, I'll take one more run at it. It seems to me like the bottom line is if you're saying we have to fund the NHS by taxing the ultra wealthy, that means that ultra wealthy have to always exist or we can't have the NHS. So the tax the rich to fund the NHS slogan will bake in inequality in my mind. So I'm thinking, I'm sure I wasn't the first person to say this, but it probably came from you or Stephanie Kelton. I'm thinking it's make the rich irrelevant.
Yeah, it's more likely to have come from Stephanie than me, but thanks for suggesting I might have said it. But absolutely, yes, indeed. Like she says in the movie, you might be nice people, but we don't need you.
So turning the corner, Stephen, this year you've been teaching the International Finance and MMT subject at Modern Money Lab. If only there was something going on at the moment around the subject of international trade to make that relevant.
Yes, it's unfortunate. We were supposed to be talking about Sri Lanka last week, and we didn't get on to Sri Lanka very much because something else happened.
Yeah, well, a few days ago, TV, Peter Navarro, Trump's senior counsel for trade, who's on TV, and he was saying Trump's tariffs are tax cuts for Americans. Is that true?
Well, there might be tax cuts for some Americans if he uses the tariffs as a sort of excuse for further cuts in taxation of billionaires.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. So he was just referring to a certain section of America. I see.
I don't know. I have very little patience for looking for a logic.
The tariffs won't be responsible for giving those tax cuts. That will just be legislation. Tariffs are taxes by definition, right?
Yeah, but the politics of it, of course, is it might give you an excuse. And that's what Donald Trump loves, the idea of a 19th century tax system with no income tax, but still having taxes, but the taxes in the form of tariffs. Now, you don't have to come from MMT for this to be true. There is no coherent approach to thinking about economic issues that sees a broad range of tariffs as an efficient approach to taxation. We do have to be careful. There are good reasons for implementing tariffs. In the earliest stages of economic development, every rich country, including, even before the US, the UK, the US, Germany, France, in more recent times, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, every country that's ended up rich in the earliest stages of economic development has developed industries behind temporary tariff protection. It's the infant industry argument for tariffs, and it can go wrong, but there's nothing logically or intellectually wrong with that argument. You might also use tariffs or other mechanisms to enhance national security. Certainly after a pandemic, you might be concerned about being dependent on imports from the rest of the world where supply chains can be interrupted, where we're talking about necessities the next time there is a global crisis. But in any case, tariffs will just be part of a much broader industrial policy designed at guiding the evolution of your economy over time. I think what's going to happen is we're going to have such a global catastrophe from what's going on at the moment that sadly tariffs in general as a policy tool, and they can be a useful policy tool, are going to be discredited.
It's really amazing to me is the complete incoherence of what Trump says about the tariffs, because he talks about it being a means to raise revenue. And the way that I've seen the calculation is actually being done. So they've calculated that the average tax rate is now 20% in the US, from the foreign sector into the domestic sector, 20%. And what they've done is they multiply 20% by the total amount of imports, the value of the imports, and then said, well, this is the income we're going to get. But of course, they're aiming at reducing their number of imports. That's the whole point of the tariffs. So that's not the income they're going to get from the tariffs. But then he says, oh, no, tariffs are not going to raise prices. Not at all. They're going to be paid by somebody else. But also industry will come here. But surely industry comes to the US only if prices are raised so that people prefer other goods, right?
Well, there is the tariff jumping argument, which is that you say to a foreign multinational, we'll tax you unless you actually make it here. But there's all sorts of problems with that in the modern world because of complex supply chains, and you're still taxing inputs that they're sourcing from overseas. But there's another incoherence with that argument. One day he's saying these tariffs are permanent, and so foreign companies should come and build factories in our economy when it's going to take them years to build those factories. And then the next day he's saying, well, we've had 50 governments contact us wanting to negotiate so we can get rid of these tariffs again. Well, that's going to mean the companies don't want to locate in the US. In any case, manufacturing is already moving back to the US. The US is the world's second biggest manufacturing nation after China. It's not that manufacturing has completely disappeared from the US. And manufacturing is moving back already, but it's moving back because of rising wages in China and Mexico and because of automation. So if manufacturing comes back to the US, there won't be many jobs in it in any case, because you're not going back to a 1950s production line with lots of people.
I saw a statistic that manufacturing jobs only constitute about 13 million workers in the US.
Because it's automated. In terms of the value of manufacturing output, the US comes second, a long way second, but second only to China.
And you bring me to the other incoherence, the fact that one of his ministers was talking about how all the jobs were going to be done by robots. When manufacturing comes back to the US, all the jobs are going to be done by robots. This is not an employment generating exercise then.
A lot of people think this is what they say, 5-dimensional chess, or that these people, they talk about Project 2025, or these people have a great plan that they're working towards. They want assets to be cheap so they can buy them all up. I think they're just a bunch of idiots. I don't think there is a coherent plan, or rather they've got something they'd like to achieve, but they don't understand economics. And so they're not going to achieve what they would like to achieve. We're just going to have chaos. And unfortunately, we have to wait 2 years for midterm elections. And even then, I'm sad to say, it's not particularly about Americans. It could be happening in Australia too, but I don't know whether it's the quality of our education systems plus the social media influences and all the rest, but people seem to have lost the ability to think critically.
But then who is advising them? I have the feeling that it's just Trump and Musk as appointed head economists in there, and then they've just hired a bunch of kind of youngsters.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
I'm hearing that like Musk himself is not a fan of a lot of this tariff stuff that he's doing. So it can't be that. What I'm hearing on British media at the moment is they will get like a Republican politician or a Republican who's not a in-office politician but a big donor on, say, Radio 4, and these guys are going, yes, we voted Republican, we voted for Trump, and there was no way we were going to vote Democrat because, you know, that would have made the country awful if we'd have had another 4 years with Democrats. So what we think is happening is that we don't agree with the tariffs, but we think it's a negotiating tactic. And this is after we've had many, many days and many, many statements of Trump going, I'm not kidding around here. This isn't leverage I'm going for. I want to rewire the world system. And so Trump is saying one thing, and then the next day he's saying, yeah, it is negotiating. And I think what's going on is these people that they're having on, these Republicans that they're having on British media, are trying to send a message. Like, and these are huge donors as well. So these are people that Trump needs, right? They're trying to send a message of, look, here's how you can appear to win here, right?
He doesn't need them now.
Not today.
He did need them. He doesn't need them now. No, not again. Unless they change the Constitution, he can't stand again.
Okay, all right. Well, let's say these are people that the Republicans need. You know, if there is such a thing that still exists, like a party that's going to outlive Trump, right?
I think they're in shock.
What I'm saying is, yeah, they are in shock and they're going, I think he's made a mistake. But the thing is, Trump never says, I've made a mistake, I'm reversing course. So, you know, we're serving this ball up there, this really easy ball for you to hit, Donald, which is really, you did mean it as a negotiating thing. And your stance about, oh, no negotiations, I'm changing the world order. That was all part of the trick that you were playing on the rest of the world. And it is a negotiating tactic. I think they're trying to give him a back door to get out of it.
The most bizarre thing of all is you mentioned his advisor on trade, Peter Navarro, earlier. Now, they've been quoting this economist who has a very favourable view, not based on any logical economics, of a broad set of tariffs such as they're using and replacing income tax with tariffs. And this person who they keep quoting in media conferences, everybody knows doesn't exist. Peter Navarro made up an economist in his book that J.D. Vance, I think, or no, it wasn't J.D. Vance, it was Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner found Peter Navarro's book a few years ago. He was asked to find some stuff on trade by father-in-law Donald, and I think the story goes he didn't necessarily read the book himself, but he found on Amazon Peter Navarro's book. And Peter Navarro then ended up being a trade advisor. Now, Navarro quotes research by an economist in his book. But the economist has a name, I can't remember what it is, but it's an anagram of Navarra.
Oh my God.
It's not genuine research by anybody, and the economist they keep quoting doesn't actually exist. So that's how bizarre the world is. But it doesn't matter, because the US, for some reason, the media in the US sort of ignore these things. They just kind of expect it now. And there's no absurdity, at least up until now, there's been no absurdity extreme enough about Donald Trump to undermine his popularity with 40% of the population. He's still got 40% of people apparently supporting him. Or these pathetic, especially on the Republican side, politicians in Washington, D.C., they're maybe scared about, perhaps they're scared for their family or their personal safety, but they're mainly scared about being primary. They just want to keep their jobs. And they don't like Donald Trump. They used to be, most of them, the sort of free traders that you and I don't like. Only 5 minutes ago, arguing that trade barriers should be removed everywhere and forcing it as part of the Washington Consensus on the Global South. And they've done 180 degrees. They're saying the complete opposite of what they were saying before, most of them, just out of selfish self-interest and perhaps a little bit of fear. They are utterly despicable, and I don't mind saying that publicly, and cowardly, and I hold them in the most enormous contempt, and they will be seen in a very negative light by history. And it's not just people like me that think that, it's principled people that we would disagree with on virtually everything from the conservative side of politics that see them in the same light.
There's a real problem for the developing world that relies so much on demand from the US to sell raw products, raw materials, and to derive an income from it, which is a shame, of course. We'll see how China reacts. I've heard reports that say that China is going to kind of embark in a more kind of domestic demand drive now. We'll see. Maybe that will be a positive. But what are the chances, you think, Stephen, of this generating a kind of a debt crisis of the types that we had in the 70s?
We're already on the edge of a debt crisis.
Yeah.
And absolutely, how do you service your US dollar debt when you can't earn US dollars? That's where we are at the moment. Now, there are some of my friends say there are positives about this, because actually what we want to see over time, as Fadel talks about, and as ecological economists like my friend Phil talk about for perhaps other reasons, we want to move away from globalization towards a future where countries in particular regions of the world do more regional trade, so more global south to global south trade, not the extractive and exploitative relationship between the global south and the global north that we have at the moment. But to facilitate that, we first of all need debt cancellation. And secondly, we need the sort of, whether you call them colonial or climate reparations, but the sort of transfers of real resources from the global north to the global south that Fadel and his colleagues were talking about at last year's COP. So we need green industrialization to take place across the global south. We need different regions of the world to enhance the collective monetary sovereignty of the countries which are within those regions, countries which are too small to be self-sufficient across a wide variety of industries, but with other countries in the same region of the world, they have that potential. If we could transition away from globalization, away from the exploitative neo-colonial relations between the global north and global south that we've got used to over the last 50 years, that would be a great thing. And the ecological impact of these long global supply chains transporting goods around the world when it's unnecessary, and when, with 3D printing and all that, in the future, these things should be much less necessary than they are now. So there is a vision of a future global economy where countries are not completely dependent on the US or China, for that matter, because we don't want to just replace one bully with another one in the future. So that's where we want to get to. But blowing up the trade system in an uncontrolled way like we are at the moment, without all those other things being in place, is going to be catastrophic. It is going to force more countries into the arms of the IMF, that's going to force more people within those countries into poverty or into extreme poverty, and it's going to hold back sustainable development in country after country, and it's going to make it more difficult for countries right the way across Africa, where there's very little renewable energy, very little solar energy at the moment outside 2 or 3 countries. It's going to make it more difficult to do all those kinds of things. It's utterly catastrophic what Donald Trump is threatening the world with. And one of the biggest mistakes he's making is that you can threaten China into backing down. Does he know nothing about Chinese culture at all?
So coming back to reasonable and positive views of trade, Stephen, you recently tweeted that chapter 5 of The Deficit Myth, winning at trade, that's your favorite chapter of the book. Why is that?
It was the most difficult one to write. And I got to go through it line by line with Stephanie when she was in Adelaide in January 2020. It was the last chapter to be written. It's a difficult one to write because it has Warren's very well thought out analysis of trade, where the wealth of a country, as Warren puts it, is the stuff that you produce plus what you can import minus what you have to export. That sort of view of the world.
The real wealth.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. But then that's a very useful way of looking at trade if you are the US or if you're Australia or even if you're the UK. But if you're in a country where, to sort of move in the Fadell Scott direction, where you have limited or no monetary sovereignty, or as post-Keynesians sometimes say, where your currency is not as far up the international hierarchy of currencies, where your sovereignty is limited, you may have a fixed exchange rate, you have a significant amount of foreign currency denominated debt, and you can't run out of your own currency, but you can run out of foreign currency, of course. You are dependent on imported necessities, energy, food, medicines, etc., which are priced in US dollars. Then you find yourself with a fear of floating your currency, because if you float your currency and it collapses on the foreign exchange market, that can be catastrophic to the living standards of people at the bottom of the income distribution. It can undermine social stability. So you end up trying to defend a fixed or overvalued and heavily managed exchange rate, and then you've got this perpetual battle to avoid national insolvency, because what you've got to do is get enough US dollars in order to keep yourself afloat. What MMT does then is focus not so much on Warren's quite very correct and insightful view of trade, but it focuses on, okay, this is where we are now. How can we improve our fiscal space, our ability to meet the needs of our people and develop our economies over time? How can we enhance our monetary sovereignty over time? And that's in the chapter 2. And there's a little bit of discussion of the Eurozone in the chapter as well. And I think the way Stephanie organised chapter 5, it is a work of art, a thing of beauty, that chapter, to put all those things in together, and all the criticisms you ever get from anybody about MMT and international trade and monetary sovereignty, they're all addressed in that chapter. And you often get people commenting on this, on MMT and trade. They say, oh, it's US-centred. It has nothing to say about low-income countries in Africa or Asia or Latin America. And there's an easy answer now, which is you haven't read chapter 5 of The Deficit Myth.
Yeah, or you are not acknowledging that Bill Mitchell exists.
Or Fadell. What Fadell is discussing is countries that don't have much monetary sovereignty at the moment, countries that aren't Japan or Australia. How can we move over time in that direction? And what can we do meantime? I mean, we may have limited monetary sovereignty, but we do issue a currency. We do have, in many countries' cases, an abundant supply of labour, and we could employ this, for example, to move towards food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, those kind of issues.
But that also places in our responsibility that the rest of the world getting that sovereignty, right? So in the African countries, it may be it's still a kind of that currency union that they have that still kind of falls back on France's colonialism of Africa, and countries like Ecuador that use the...
Absolutely, yeah. We had Ndongo give a talk for us in January. It was terrific.
I'll make sure I link to that.
And within that, of course, he laid out, and actually that is now, as I told him at the time, that's now part of our international finance and MMT course, I made room for that lecture to be permanently part of, at least for a while, until he revises and updates it, part of our course. And he looks at options within West Africa, and it was pretty much what I was talking about before. It's moving towards national currencies, but then promoting trade within countries in the region where they use each other's currencies and have swap line agreements between national central banks. That's the direction to move in over time. And then it's a question of how do we avoid making mistakes like single West African currency with Eurozone style rules would be not much better than what they have at the moment.
Just to dig into that chapter a little bit, I like how Stephanie says we need to stop thinking of trade as something that we beat other countries at by running a trade surplus. And speaking of that sort of winning and losing, in inverted commas, at trade, in the UK, we've had high-powered industry figures advising against the UK imposing counter tariffs, arguing that a trade war with the US is a war that the UK can only lose. What would you advise if you had their ear? I guess we're in similar situations, the Australia, the US. Would you advise counter tariffs? Let's just let the Americans get on with it, slug it out with China, or something else.
Why would you not to hurt yourself? Because it's like seeing somebody else sort of slash themselves with a knife and deciding to do that to yourself as well.
Right. Simple answer.
If you cut yourself, I'm going to cut myself. Stop cutting yourself or I'll cut myself too.
Is it right for me to say that the countries, because he's imposed tariffs on every single country in the world, but in the UK, countries like the UK and some countries in South America, he's imposed 10%, that as a result of, say, the kind of disparity between the tariffs that he's charging countries like China, then that may reroute more exports through the countries that face the lower rate tariffs. And as a result, the UK may actually be a net beneficiary as opposed to the exporters within the UK.
That's called trade diversion. If it happens to any extent, of course, then you just change the situation. But yes, there is that possible trade diversion effect. Again, this is illiteracy, though. Why does the UK have a 10% tariff? Because like Australia, the UK has on trading goods a trade deficit with the US. But if you were to include services, as anybody who was literate would do, then the UK would have a higher tariff rate as a result. Obviously, the tariff is only, generally speaking, collected on goods, but it's only because he's focusing on goods. And it's even more absurd with Australia. Australia has a trade deficit with the US, but of course we have a huge trade surplus with China. China takes loads of our iron ore, turns it into goods and sells the goods to America. So indirectly, Australia presumably has a big trade surplus with America, but directly we have a bilateral trade deficit. So that's why we have the low 10% tariff. They're basically, as I said, illiterate idiots.
But the reason why I'm saying this is because I see Keir Starmer kind of being pushed into either retaliation or negotiation and trying to accept chlorinated chicken from the States, when in fact he needs to do nothing here. As you say, why would we impose tariffs to hurt ourselves and retaliate in that way? And second, indirectly, it might actually end up benefiting the exporters within the UK.
I don't think the UK is going to benefit overall because I think the European Union is going to lose out hugely. And Britain's main trade is with the European Union.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it's bad news. But Britain is better placed than most other countries because Britain is one of the few countries to have a bilateral trading goods deficit with the US.
And also, Britain is one of those countries that can create employment if needs be.
Well, absolutely. Well, I think any country can create employment if needs be. But if you're a full monetary sovereign, you've got more freedom of action to do that without being so worried about the potential consequences.
Okay, so just wrapping up the trade topic, in the chapter 5, Stephanie encourages to ditch trade war and work towards trade peace. What would that look like?
Do you know who she's more or less quoting there? It's chapter 24 of the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. It's John Maynard Keynes who said, basically, if we could just all agree to ensure we have full employment in our economies, then we could stop fighting over trade the way we do now. Because when we fight over trade, and basically we're fighting over jobs, but we don't need to have a trade war in order to have full employment domestically. We can just decide to have full employment domestically. And that's one of our messages. First of all, using our fiscal space, but then secondly, of course, using a national job guarantee as well. We can aim for non-inflationary, full employment, and then we do not have to run our international economic relations as though we are in a competitive fight with the rest of the world to be able to provide people with jobs.
Great stuff. So moving into the home straight, Stephen, for our UK listeners, Modern Money Lab UK are running 2 very special weekend events with you on the last 2 weekends in June. Can you tell us all about those?
I can, yes, absolutely. We have run 2 different weekend events, interactive seminars with people in Australia, in New Zealand, and in Bernie country in the US, in Vermont. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been doing this. One of these events is called Rethinking Capitalism, and we're going to be running this in White City on the 21st and 22nd of June. And Rethinking Capitalism, it includes modern monetary theory within it, but it's basically an interactive seminar where we discuss a variety of some of the most pressing issues facing the UK and the world today. So inequality, like we've been talking about this evening, economic insecurity, the climate crisis, MMT and the national budget. I talk a little bit about the philosophy of economic inquiry, and we end up talking about a campaign, an ongoing campaign for a fairer and more sustainable economy. MMT is an important part of this weekend, but so is ecological economics, talking about planetary boundaries and how to live within them, and precepts of sustainability and how the world is doing at the moment. And we'll be talking about how the UK is doing at the moment too. I'll mention the second weekend in a minute, but for both weekends, what this is not is somebody who regards themselves as an expert standing at the front talking at people. That's not what this is about at all. We found these weekends to be very popular, and we've often had local campaign groups set up and continue to meet, in some cases for years afterwards, where people have met and started chatting to new contacts on this weekend and found that there are a lot more people out there with the same kind of interests and values that they have, and people feel empowered to go on and get involved politically, inside or outside political parties, and engage in campaigns to approach politicians and put pressure on them. So what we do is, across the weekend, I take people on a journey with 8 or 9 sessions where I talk for about half an hour, and then people go into small discussion groups and they chat. We provide a few suggested questions, but people could talk about whatever they want, really, for another half an hour or so, and then we go on to the next topic. So we start off with this first weekend talking about basically where capitalism came from, how it's evolved to 2025, and why we need to rethink what we value and how we value goods and activities and people in the future. Then the next session is the ecological one. Then the next session is modern monetary theory. And the next session is inequality. We go like that for the whole weekend. The second weekend, which is in Finsbury Park on the 28th and 29th of June, is a more narrowly focused MMT weekend. It's called Money, Government and the Public Interest, Beyond the Deficit Myth. And the description says this workshop will empower participants to counter the common narrative that significant public interest investment is unaffordable or must be paid for by implementing austerity measures. Whether for healthcare, education, climate action, or whatever is needed, you'll come away with a true understanding of how governments spend money and what is possible. And so in this one, we start off talking a little bit about the history and nature of money, and then we talk about national budgeting in an economy like the UK, and then we talk about the big bad wolf of inflation and where the pandemic inflation came from and where inflations of the past have come from, and an effective way of approaching the risk of inflation in the future. And then we talk about what central banks like the Bank of England can do and what they can't do, And then we get on to talking about issues relating to international finance and exchange rates and foreign currency denominated debt in countries with little or no monetary sovereignty and proposals for reforming the global monetary system. But again, it's the same approach where I'll talk for about half an hour and then we'll have a few paragraphs from an article or something and people will get to chat to others for the next half an hour. And the idea again is that I take you on a journey. We've done money, government and the public interest twice so far. I did it in Sydney and Melbourne, and they were practices for coming to the UK. So, I've done my previews. I'm now ready to hit the big time in Finsbury Park. Rethinking capitalism, I've done about 20 times. As I said, all around the world, including in Auckland, New Zealand. We got on TV. It got on the equivalent of Question Time in New Zealand, basically. That won't happen in the UK.
Oh, you never know.
Well, I'd like somebody else to be on there rather than me. But yes, we do want to make a big noise. I really want a lot of people to come. And these weekend events will be a lot of fun. So if you can possibly come to one or both of them, please do. I'm sick of the austerity narrative in the UK. And what I've sometimes been frustrated about, although I love and admire people hugely, is I've been to a lot of MMT conferences and they're great, but they do involve basically great people at the front giving talks. And they become a little bit spectator events sometimes. This is not a spectator event. I'm not going to do most of the work. I shouldn't use the word work perhaps because it feels like it's not fun. You're going to do most of it if you come along because I'm just going to guide you and suggest what direction you might want to think about. And I want ideas to come from the discussions people have in small groups. I am a Londoner, but I've lived here for 25 years. I'm not the expert in the UK economy. You're the experts. And I want to encourage people to form connections. I want to make a loud noise. I want somebody there who, yes, knows Jeremy Corbyn, better still knows Rachel Reeves, better still knows that, I've forgotten his name now, the bond trader you mentioned earlier, Gary
Stevenson.
Better still knows George Monbiot. I mean, we'll invite him, but I doubt that he'll actually come. I would like to make a loud noise. I'm tired of going to conferences and nothing happening afterwards.
Absolutely, yeah.
We want to shift the narrative, and I'm desperate for a lot of people to come. Like so much else we've done, including the degree we run, it's just me taking a ridiculous leap in the dark in the hope that it's going to trigger something, that something's going to change, that some small thing we do is going to have a disproportionately big impact on the world. And we thought, if we're going to come to the UK and do all those carbon emissions, we've got 2 weekends. Let's not do one of them. Let's do both. That's what we're going to do.
Great stuff. And I wanted to just bring up something. There are prices to suit every pocket, is what I want to say, in terms of ticket prices. You've got a concession rate. It's very cheap.
Well, we feed people. Yeah, we feed people. Yeah. So basically, what we try and do, we're not going to cover the cost of travelling over or anything, and we're not trying to. But what we try to do is on hiring the venue and getting the catering in, we try and break even. But the main reason for charging people something to come is that we found in the past that often when events are free, people quite understandably will sign up because they think, it might be interesting. But then something will happen, I don't know, and they just won't be able to come. They don't turn up. And if you have at least a nominal charge, then people tend more often to actually come. It's important to have some sort of control like that because otherwise you can sell out and deny people the opportunity to come. And then you find out you've got lots of gaps on the day. But if there is anybody who genuinely, and there must be people, who would be interested in coming and you can't afford to make the payment, then come along anyway. The more the merrier to come along. Because as I said, this is not about making money or even trying to cover costs. We've got some kind donors that are doing that. It's about trying to get people engaged. We're halfway towards maybe winning the Green Party over to our point of view. I'd like to be all the way with that. I'd like whatever Jeremy Corbyn launches to be doing the same thing. And I'd like the grassroots of the Labour Party to rise up in revolt and take the party and the government back.
I'm so with you on this. There's another heads up for our UK listeners while we're talking about this. Modern Money Lab UK are also running a conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September 2025. That's entitled Anything We Can Actually Do, We Can Afford, Debunking Money Myths to End Austerity in the UK. So another date for the diary there for UK people. Stephen, where does that line come from? Anything we can do, we can afford.
Well, that comes from, I think it was a radio talk that John Maynard Keynes did during the Second World War, but it definitely comes from Lord Keynes, that one.
So just to wrap up, Stephen, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I can't wait to see you on these weekends. Just to wrap up, in your book, you mentioned that before you start reading a book, you like to read the last sentence of the book first. I'm not going to quite do that, but in your book, it's not quite the last sentence, but in the second to last paragraph, you quote Hyman Minsky. The quote is, "The game of policy making is rigged. The theory used determines the questions that are asked and the options that are presented. The prince is constrained by the theory of his intellectuals." And then you write, "We must unrig the game." So, Stephen, how do we, as in you and me and the people listening right now, how do we unrig the game?
Well, we all have to push in the same direction. It's very difficult unrigging the game. It's very difficult changing a paradigm, but we do have to change the paradigm as far as economics is concerned. The old neoclassical or neoliberal economics that everybody is familiar with has failed us and is continuing to fail us. It's led us to Donald Trump. It's led us to inequality. It's led us to global south debt and entrenched poverty around the world, and we need to get beyond it. It's no longer, if it was ever fit for purpose, it's not fit for purpose in the last 3/4 of the 21st century. And I don't know how we make that kind of change. I'm not a Hyman Minsky, who was, in my view, one of the most underrated economists of the 20th century. I'm not a Warren Mosler. I'm not a Bill Mitchell, although I think their work is really important. I'm not a Stephanie Kelton. But if we all push in the same direction and we continue to spread the word that there are viable alternatives out there and we can build a better future. The economy is something that human beings have constructed. It's not a natural entity, and it's something that we can reconstruct, that we can build differently into the future. We can have an equitable, sustainable future with lower inequality, both within the national economy and also globally. It's not an impossible thing to do. And these events, and our degree as well, really, are about trying to empower people to go out and spread the word and build a movement and change things that at the moment seem as though that to many people seem as though it's impossible to change. We can change them. And I think we may reach a tipping point quite quickly, and history is moving in our direction. And when the opportunity comes along, we need a lot of people who are well versed in the kinds of ideas and proposals that are going to be the root of building a better tomorrow.
That's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking to Professor Stephen Hale, founder of Modern Money Lab, which is the place to go if you want to take your understanding of MMT, real-world economics, and ecological economics to the next level. Modern Money Lab run online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields. And as we've been talking about, for our UK listeners, don't forget, Stephen will be teaching 2 workshops in London on the last 2 weekends in June, aimed at rethinking capitalism and countering this narrative that our beloved national treasures like the NHS need to be quote unquote paid for by the ultra rich, or else with crippling, deadly austerity measures. These weekends are being run by Modern Money Lab UK, who will also be running a conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September 2025, entitled Anything We Can Actually Do, We Can Afford. So I'll link to modernmoneylab.org.uk in the show notes, whereas ever for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Stephen Hale.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Patricia.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, You can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.